Happy Monday. I hope you are getting a chance to enjoy your snow day. We're just going to go over the structure of the heart and where blood is moving throughout. So we've got a nice little diagram of the heart there in the center. Yay, heart. Okay. And so let's start by looking at exactly where that is in your body. Okay, very simple. Right now you're seeing two different cavities of the body, two different areas. And that bottom cavity down here is all called the abdominal cavity. So we already took a look at that. You've got the liver right in this area. You've got your stomach coming down, intestines, and it is separated from the thoracic cavity up here by this little piece of tissue, which we very briefly talked about, and now is going to be a good time to revisit that. So in red, I highlighted for you the diaphragm. And within the thoracic cavity, there are two major organs that you need to know. Obviously, the heart is here in the center and all of its associated pieces. And we've got the two lungs, which are already labeled down here for you. So as a quick review, your abdominal cavity is everything below the diaphragm. Your thoracic cavity is everything above. Okay, now if we move on to see a live version, we've got the pig. Sorry, I didn't give you a bit of a warning for that first. Zoom out a little bit here. So I'm going to give you a couple of seconds to see what you can identify. And you can pause if you'd like, and I'll start labeling that here in just a minute. Okay, so I've gone ahead and labeled everything for you. I'd recommend making a note of this. We're at about 2 minutes. If after you've gone through everything, I'd recommend rewinding the video, starting back at just before 2 minutes when I took that pause, and then seeing if you're able to identify everything here for you. So let me go ahead and get my laser. Right in the center, you've got the heart. Now, very, very important that you're recognizing this. You are looking at the pig from its front aspect. So right here, this is a lung, but it is the left lung. Make sure you understand that when you're looking at something, everything appears backwards because you're looking at the front of it. So the left lung here, all of this. The right lung, which I believe was slightly torn off, and then in behind here is more lung. So heart, left lung, right lung, and diaphragm. And now on to a few things that you're probably not yet familiar with, and that's okay. Starting with the aorta is here, this little piece of tissue. The superior vena cava, so you're going to have actually the the jugular veins coming down into the vena cava here. And I think for this one, that's all you really need to know. And of course, your rib cage, you can see those in here and on this side. So let's continue on with a very simplistic diagram. Now, you are going to be responsible for doing two things. First, if you see anything like this, you will need to label all of the parts. You'll also need to draw this, but I will show you a much more simplified version of that, so don't think you need it in this detail. And so I'm going to start by breaking the heart into two main areas. Whenever you're looking at the heart, you need to remember that the right and left sides are switched. So I'm going to start right off at the beginning by labeling which is the right and which is the left here. So let me get my colors. Everything over here is the right. Switch some colors here. And everything over here is the left. And of course, I did pick blue and red for a reason. That is because everything on the right side of the heart is deoxygenated. Now, you probably heard blue blood and red blood when you were in elementary school and thought that as soon as blood hit the oxygen or hit the air that it would turn red. That's not true. All of your blood is red, but for the purpose of kind of diagramming this out, it's a lot easier if we use two separate colors. So everything on the right is going to be blue, which is representing blood, which does not yet have oxygen, and everything on the left, as I said, is oxygenated. So now we need to start tracing where all of the blood is coming from and going to. So I'm going to start by zooming in a little bit here. And now you can see that there are 4 main chambers. I'm not sure how easy that is for you to see. We've got one large chamber here and here, an even larger chamber here and here. So these two are on the right side, these two are on the left. back here. So we're staying on the right-hand side, and we're going to start at the top. We're going to start by labeling those chambers that are on the right. So this is the right atrium. You have one atrium, two atria. Okay, so on the top are your atria. Your right atrium and your right ventricle. And it is mirrored on both sides. So atria on top, ventricles on the bottom. All right. Now above the right atrium, and in fact, let me come out a little bit here. Okay. This is the superior vena cava. Okay, superior meaning above in terms of body positioning. So it is more towards the head than it is towards the feet, ergo it is superior. And for that exact reason, any guesses as to what we'd call this? Anybody? Anybody? No guesses? Okay. This is our inferior vena cava. Okay, so this is taking blood, systemic blood, meaning from the rest of your body. And in the case of the inferior vena cava, it's taking everything from the heart down. In the case of the inferior vena cava, it's taking everything from the heart up. So head and arm, any kind of used blood is going into the superior vena cava. Any used blood from the bottom portion of the body, legs, abdominal, viscera, etc., is all coming into the inferior vena cava. Now what it's doing is all going to the atrium. I know that it looks like it's going into the ventricle here. If you take a look though, what's actually happening is you've got this blood coming in behind the ventricle and then popping up right in this little opening here and in this opening up here for the two vena cava. And then blood is collecting into the right atrium. And again, this is deoxygenated blood. So the goal is going to be to take this blood and move it to the lungs. However, we're not quite ready to do that. The atrium is going to be a holding spot until we can enter into the ventricle. Now the ventricle is going to be where blood is pumped, and all of this muscle right here is going to be responsible for pumping blood. And where is it going to go? It is going right up through here. These are called your pulmonary arteries. And there's two of them, and as you guessed it, this one here is going to be your left, and this one here is going to be your right. So both of these are leading to the lungs. So retrace that one more time just to make sure we're understanding the flow of blood. It's coming in the inferior and superior vena cava, into the atrium, down through here, into the ventricle, up through here, into the left or right pulmonary arteries. And at that point, we're going to pick up some blood from the lungs. Okay. Fast forward a little bit, it's time to talk about the lungs. The lungs are going to be where oxygen is exchanged, you're dropping off carbon dioxide, and at that point we have red blood or oxygenated blood, and that is coming in from the pulmonary veins. And same sequence as before, we're starting in an atrium, right in here, going down into the ventricle. So pulmonary veins into the left atrium, then into the left ventricle, and finally up here. Now it's kind of hard to see right here, but this is a little, we'll talk about those valves in a second, but this is the biggest artery in your body, and this is called your aorta. Okay? I'd recommend kind of going back through that a couple of times, but to summarize that. Okay, blood from the rest of your body is going to come into either the superior or inferior vena cava and briefly collect in the right atrium until it's able to move into the right ventricle. That right ventricle has a small layer of muscle right along here, and when that contracts, it's going to push the blood up into the right and left pulmonary arteries. Blood is going to exchange oxygen with the lung tissue, and from there, now it has become oxygenated, it's going to re-enter into the heart via the pulmonary veins, okay? One's on each side, right and left. Pulmonary veins going to collect in the left atrium, move down into the left ventricle. Now, quick comparison, notice that the right ventricle has a very thin muscular wall. We're only pumping blood a short distance into the lungs, but the left ventricle has a very, very thick muscular wall, and the purpose is because we're going to need to take that blood and pump it all throughout the rest of the body. So we've got it from the left atrium into the left ventricle, up into the aorta, very, very thick artery, and that is bringing the blood to the rest of your body. Okay, go over that however many times you need to, and let's go ahead and move on. So here's the diagram, very simplistically, and I'm going to circle some things that I would expect you to, at this point, be able to identify. Okay, everything in green you should be able to identify, so go ahead, take a minute, pause, and see how many of those you can get. Okay, so a quick review. Going right down in order. Right here we've got the aorta, our superior vena cava and inferior vena cava. I lied, I'm not going to go in order. So our vena cava, which lead into, oops, I missed one here. This right here would be your right atrium and your right ventricle. So right atrium, right ventricle. And then again, the right side is going to the lungs, so this becomes the left pulmonary artery on this side and breaks off to become the right pulmonary artery on this side. So vena cava, atrium, right ventricle, up into the pulmonary arteries, out into the lungs, back in through the pulmonary veins. So 10 are your left pulmonary veins, 4 are your right pulmonary veins, and those are leading into the left atrium, down into another one that I missed. I should have circled 14, which is your left ventricle, up into your aorta. So this kind of tucks in behind the left pulmonary artery, up and around, there's your aorta. And in fact, this goes behind the heart and becomes your descending aorta. When you feel your heartbeat in your stomach, you're actually feeling your descending aorta. Now we need to spend some time talking about the ones that we didn't circle in the first place. Namely, these little flaps all in here. And what those are valves. Valves are going to be responsible for making sure that blood has a one-way flow. Blood flows this way, the valves are open. Blood tries to go this way, it closes the valves so that they're not able to go through in the opposite direction. So we actually have two sets of these valves. You have the ones between the atrium and ventricles, and those are on both sides. And then you have the one between the ventricle and whatever comes next, either the pulmonary arteries or the aorta, okay? And in all cases, they're making sure the blood is flowing in only one direction. So we'll start out by drawing what direction that blood should be flowing. Again, the right side has deoxygenated blood, so I'm going to draw that in blue. So blood needs to be going from atrium to ventricle and from ventricle to artery. Okay, and again, same idea, draw some arrows in here. In red, we're going from atrium to ventricle and ventricle to aorta. So now we need to know the names of those pieces. So I'm going to scroll down just a little bit so I have some room. Okay. So the ones between the atrium and the ventricle have a very, very tricky name. They're called the atrio, because they're attached to the atrium, ventricular, because, you know, they're attached to the ventricle, valve. So I lied, it's not too tricky. It is the AV valve, and if we're going to be specific, we need to call it either the right AV valve or the left AV valve. So the one over on the right side is the right atrioventricular valve. You may not just call it the AV valve. You will not get a mark for that. It is the right atrioventricular valve or the left atrioventricular valve. And similarly, we're going to name the two valves going to the pulmonary artery and aorta using the right or the left nomenclature. However, in this case, it is a little bit different. They're called semilunar valves. So let me get that going, and I'll write it down here. Semilunar valve. because when you look at them from the bottom, they look like half moon shapes. So we've got one right here, and that again is the right semilunar valve and the left semilunar valve. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and erase everything that you see here, and you should be able to go back and label every single piece. Go ahead and hit pause until you're ready, and then go back and check, and we'll move on. Okay, so I mentioned in the previous slide that not only do you have to be able to label a diagram of the heart, but you will need to also be able to draw it. And don't get too anxious. I know it sounds like a lot, especially with all the lines that you just saw, but I'm going to walk you through a much easier way of diagramming it, because of course you don't need to be 100% anatomically correct so long as you're drawing something that shows the flow of blood. So we'll start off very, very simply by drawing a shield. Not very pretty, but that's okay. Remember to always have the right and left sides properly labeled. It's okay to include abbreviations so long as you start by telling them what the abbreviation means. So don't just start calling things the RA if you mean the right atrium. Don't call it the LV if you mean the left ventricle, unless you have already written left ventricle to mean either left atrium or ventricle. Okay, so as we saw, the heart actually tilts slightly to the left. That's okay. We're drawing a diagram. It doesn't have to be anatomically perfect. Now we're thinking about, where does blood flow? And the very first place that blood is going to flow is into the right atrium. So we need to go ahead and draw a vessel that goes in there. So I'm going to just kind of draw an opening. And that is going to be representative of my vena cava. And now from there, I'm going to need some way for blood to move from my right atrium into my right ventricle. So again, I'm going to go ahead and take my eraser, make a small opening in there, and again another opening which is going to allow me to go upwards and out to my pulmonary arteries. So I've got blood coming in. Actually, let me go ahead and at the end I'll draw the flow of blood. But blood coming in, and a couple of valves there. So hopefully that part makes sense. I'm going to mirror and do basically the same thing on the other side. Show where my blood is coming in. In this case, it's going to be from my pulmonary vein, pulmonary vein, sorry, I had to think there for a minute, into my left atrium, into my left ventricle, then up into this little tube, and go ahead and draw in everything that we need here. Valves, more valves, and there we go, and we can draw in that this side is nice and thick. And a thin little muscular layer here for the right side. Okay, so there's my diagram of the heart. I'm going to go back in and label everything. I'm going to show those same red and blue colors that we've already seen. At this point, you should be looking at this and being able to figure out what everything is. So, blood is coming in, down, back up, to lungs here, from body here, which means this is your vena cava, your right atrium, your right ventricle. I'm abbreviating. You would not do this. And that big long word that you need to remember, your right atrioventricular valve, your right AV valve, and your right semilunar valve. A lot of arrows showing where the blood flow is, showing what's being labeled, and now we need to do all of this again on the right side. So here we go. This is going to be from lungs down into the left atrium, then into the left ventricle, through the left atrioventricular valve, up through the left semilunar valves. I'm not going to label those, I just don't have enough room. And up the aorta, to the body. And I didn't label here. This is your pulmonary vein and pulmonary, come on, artery. All right, I hope that helped. Go back and review. Make sure you're able to label everything, get a couple of blank pieces of white paper, and see how many marks you should be able to get. I'd estimate no fewer than 10. So practice, practice, practice. Make sure you can do it, and hopefully I'll have a chance to see you tomorrow. Have a good night.